Today, we talk one of the most popular startup strategies, the productive struggle. We talk briefly about its history, how we define it, and how to pull it off to dominate your dynasty leagues. Welcome into the Dino Construction Podcast. I'm your host, Justin. Joining me as always, my co-hosts, David and JP. We actually had a little debate about this term, the productive struggle, whether it strictly applies to startups, if you can use it for existing teams, etc. So we did a deep dive on where the term came from and the history. And JP, you have some very intriguing information to present us here on this startup strategy.
Yeah, from what we found, this startup strategy was introduced by Ryan McDowell in 2014 in an article published by DLF. And it's actually dated June 29th of 2014, exactly 10 years ago from the day we're recording, funny enough. According to Ryan, he originally was using the term subtle tanking, but didn't like it because he isn't actively trying to lose in this strategy. The term used today came from an unlikely place. Ryan, at least at the time, was a third grade teacher, and during a math training, the presenter introduced the idea of giving the students space to struggle through a problem rather than giving them immediate guidance when they showed signs of struggling. The presenter called this process a productive struggle, and Ryan found it perfect for this startup strategy. The general idea is to accept you will not likely be competitive in year one and to adjust your sights on building a long-term dynasty by taking advantage of aggressive managers who try to sell their future first for a title shot in year one. The basic parts of this strategy: punt RB in year one, collect young building blocks, specifically a wide receiver. You want to fill out your best lineup each week, but rely on your weak RB position to give you a disadvantage each week. You don't want to lose track of the main goal. If you're a fringe playoff team, and sell youth for a veteran who might slightly increase your playoff chances. On the other side, don't sell good young players just because your team is doing well and not tracking for the 101. One thing that was a little interesting to us was that while the article was a lot heavier on player takes and didn't mention collecting future draft capital too often, I mean, we weren't playing back then, so it could just be a product of how the game was played back then. Yeah, we'll link the first article here we found on the topic below. It might be behind a paywall. If it is, apologies. But yeah, we thought it was a very great read to give us an understanding of what the origins of productive struggle are.
Yeah, thanks, JP. Disappointed. We put an Ron Burgundy with a question mark on there. We thought he'd read it off the teleprompter. We'll get him next time, David. I think knowing the origin helps us understand, but obviously the strategy has evolved as the game has evolved a lot over the years. David, is that basically how you would define it as well, or would you phrase or add anything differently?
Yeah, I think it's changed a bit over the time. And I think, honestly, if you're into this kind of strategy or if you're new to Dynasty and trying to learn how to approach a startup, I do recommend giving that article a read. A bit has changed, but it's really interesting read. And I think it's good to learn from the inventor of the strategy. JP kind of touched on it. One of the biggest things is I think it's a lot less centered around player takes and a lot more about just accruing value in the form of draft picks. And then one thing I think kind of has gone, I don't know about unnoticed, but it's less emphasized in the way I see a lot of people implement this strategy today, is the word productive often gets overlooked. Or, getting the 101 is great. It's not exactly the goal. The goal first is to build a strong core and be able to have those pieces to build around. So like he even said, the goal isn't tanking. That's why he didn't want to use the term subtle tanking. So just don't forget that you're trying to compete. You don't want to, like we said in the video earlier this week, you don't want to rebuild longer than you have to. So don't forget that it's a productive struggle, not just a struggle. And JP, what else would you like to add or push back maybe on something?
Yeah, in general, I agree. And with the productive struggle, I think roster construction is just super important. I mean, my cornerstone pieces are going to be drafted. I think the cornerstones are guys in those first 4 to 5 rounds, and we want to be investing in quarterback and a wide receiver. In it, they talked about wide receiver a good bit, but quarterback, we know nowadays, especially with Superflex's popularity, quarterbacks are just extremely valuable. We know that the great wide receivers and quarterbacks also hold value year over year really well. They have a long shelf life. I mean, I wouldn't even mind holding a young stud tight end if I feel like the value is there. But as David mentioned, we are aiming for a high draft pick a lot of times, but it doesn't have to be the 101. We don't have to make our team just absolutely a disaster to, it's going to make it hard to recover from. We know some people that do that, puts you on track to rebuild for multiple years, and that is not the goal. It's to do 1, maybe 2 years. But so even though I like to have strong pieces from the top rounds, yeah, I'm just not looking to add the old guys in general because, like we said, it's somewhat productive, but we're still trying to stay young to build that dynasty. So we're not just trying to go all in on 1 year like the Saints. They just keep trying to win, and they won't just take a year, to get a cornerstone piece. And yeah, we see how like Tom Brady, just that kind of player, just turns around your whole team for what 20 years essentially. Now I'm not saying we're going to get that kind of impact from the 101, 102, whatever it is, but it makes a huge difference to get one of those young assets like a Marvin Harrison Jr. that are going to turn around your team to help you for 10, 15 years or so.
Yeah, and I mean, we never know that those young players are going to help us for 10, 15 years, but we certainly do want to try to build around a bunch of young cornerstones. I think we all typically agree on this general definition of this productive struggle strategy. Now that we've kind of defined what this is, David, I know you really like this strategy. Can you tell us why you like it and give us some tips on how to pull it off as well?
Yeah, I like this strategy because we're trying to build dynasties, not just win one year. And I think a great quote from Ryan's article that I read, I'm trying to become the New England Patriots or San Antonio Spurs of my dynasty leagues, not the Arizona Cardinals or the Orlando Magic. Now, this was written in 2014. We might replace Arizona Cardinals, Orlando Magic with a couple different teams, but they had both recently made or won a finals appearance. So that fits the point for the timeline. Basically, the point is that we want to build teams that can compete for several years, not one who has a great season every now and then and is really bad in the off years. Though you'd rather be bad than mid most of the time. Just kind of depends on your direction. But the point is, we want to be competing year to year. I'll admit the first few times that I pulled this off, I got really lucky. I actually went back and pulled up probably the most lopsided startup trade I've ever received. I moved back from my 7th round startup pick to the 8th round, and I got a future first. It wasn't next year first, but it was 2024 first, and this was before the 23 season. But still, I got a first round pick to move back from the 7th to the 8th. It's basically a free 8th round startup pick, maybe even more. Getting lucky helps, but it helps with every strategy. Something else, outside of that, a few tips that I'm looking for. First of all, it's hard to pull off when a bunch of managers are trying this. It's a really popular strategy right now. A lot of people are trying it. A lot of people go in wanting to do this. So don't go into your startup saying, I'm going to productive struggle. I like to do it, but I don't want to force it. And something that I suggest to help inform that decision before your startup starts, if you've never played with your league mates before, do some advanced scouting. Go on to Dynasty Daddy, go on to one of these other sites that lets you see what they do. You can see if, they've collected a bunch of future firsts, or if there's a bunch of guys that trade their future firsts. You can kind of see the shape of their teams. Not every single team is going to be exact how managers like to run their teams. But I think especially if you can look at a few teams, you can get a pretty good idea for how they might want to approach this. And then here's another one. I don't know if everyone would agree with this tip for a productive struggle. I don't want to trade my first round startup pick. I know it's where you can get the most value. But especially if I can get an elite quarterback, I want my elite quarterback to build around. It's so much harder to get them outside of a startup. That's your cheapest opportunity to get quarterback to build around. So don't mortgage that for just some picks or something. Make sure you're still in a position to get good core players if you do move back. Moving back with your second or third, this is really a good spot to add value. Justin, I'm going to bring up a trade you had because I was really jealous I didn't pull it off, and I should have looking back. But it was pretty much the perfect productive struggle trade if you ask me. And I think it is reasonable to be able to pull off, a lot more reasonable than my 7th, 8th move back. He moved back from his 2nd round startup pick to the 3rd round, and he gained a 25 first. And Justin was still able to get one of the players he was actually considering with his 2nd round startup pick.
And that guy took a running back. He took a running back.
And I even knew that he loved that guy. So part of the reason I was kicking myself for not reaching out to him. That's what you're trying to do. You're trying to move back and stay in an area that's still relatively flat. So you're still going to get a similar player, but you're gaining picks out of it. In this case, you got a free first out of it, essentially. So that was a great move. Once you get past these high upside players, the players that you might consider part of your core, like JP was saying, in the 4th or 5th ish, I see it, mid 5th, maybe even in the 6th sometimes. Just kind of depends on how the draft falls. But at that point, just start offering that pick for a future first. Like if you've committed, by that point, you should know if you're committed to a productive struggle or not. If you are, sell the pick, get the points off your team, and get a future first. That's great. Another big thing, just remember, as Ryan pointed out when he introduced this strategy, sell yourself short on running backs. And that doesn't mean don't have any running backs. It just means basically, like JP said, don't have starting running backs. You want guys we can sell midseason for value spikes to get more draft capital, but you don't want points at that position.
Yeah, I think another great way, and it kind of expands on like what Justin was able to do. I think there's certain points in the draft where you notice like, oh, I got like 12 players in the same tier, and I'm right at the top. Yeah, I'll trade back even for a 2nd round pick a lot of times, or try to get as much as I can, because that's the whole point of the productive struggle, is just to accrue as much value as possible. And I think tiers are one of the best ways to do that. Whether it's get your favorite dynasty tier rankings and follow those specifically, because if you can trade back from you're in tier 2 of wide receiver, and you see, oh, I think Garrett Wilson's the same as Puka Nacua or something. You could trade back and you get some value. I'm going to do that because the tiers are there for a reason. They're the same players within the same range of outcomes, and you want to take advantage of that. 100% agree. You want to get as many picks as possible after. I think it's round 5 to the top of round 6. I think there's a massive drop off in like the young players that really could rise and ascend. That's where it starts to get into guys like Debo and I don't know Cooper Cup. Those kind of guys I don't really want. There's a lot of guys in that range that are more so meant for contenders. And you just got to look. I mean, once you're in round 5 or 6, just look like, all right, who are the teams that are contending? All right, let me go reach out to those guys. You just really have to see what the other teams are doing. And also, you can even take advantage. I've done this a good bit to where if I see the other teams that are rebuilding, I know, okay, they're targeting the wide receivers. I'd be fine moving up 3 or 4 spots too, just to get ahead of those guys because I know they're going to take a young wide receiver, especially if it's at the end of a tier. I like to manipulate the draft board a lot like that. I'm like, okay, yeah, sure, I can move back 5 or 6 spots in the 7th, 8th round because the 5 teams after me are all contenders and they're not going to be drafting the same players as me most likely. So I think that's another great way to take advantage of your league. But you just had to be active and just looking at the whole landscape in general, and you can get a lot of advantages that way.
Now, with the productive struggle, I think it's a great strategy to adopt if one of 2 things, if you're the first team doing it, preferably the only team or one of 2 at the most teams doing it, like David said earlier. I always like to, at the very start of a draft, I have, depending on the number of starters, but in a start 11, for example, which is typically what we're playing, I will send out trade offers through my 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th round picks usually, depending on where my 3rd round pick is, where like if it's an early 3rd, I'm going to ask for a 5th back and a 1st. I'm going to send that to every team. If it's for my 4th, I'm going to ask for a 7th and a 1st back. For my 5th round pick, I'm going to ask for an 8th and a 1st back. For my 6th, I'll ask for a 9th and a 1st back. And these are all maybe a little lofty asks, and I'm willing to negotiate down, but I will send out those offers to every single manager just to show I mean business. While it depends on where those 3rds are, maybe it is still part of maybe cornerstone assets. Even in like a start 9, I'm willing to do these same types of offers, but I'm not willing to maybe negotiate the picks that I'm getting back as much from those starting points because I think that I can still compete year 1, even if I sell my 5th round pick for a 9th or a 10th or even an 11th round pick and a 1st round pick back in the next year. Because in the 11th round, if I want to decide to take a win now wide receiver or win now running back, I can get the same production and still have an asset that's probably as valuable as that 5th round pick in the 25 first. So I like to always try to build a kind of, you can squint and see a competing team in a startup, but where I am very willing to say, hey, I drafted Najee Harris in the 10th round, Deontay Johnson in the 9th round, and I drafted Raheem Mostert in the 12th round. I can try to sell all of these players for 2nds and 3rds later on, and I'm only taking those guys if I have them a tier above everyone else. But either I'm entirely committed to the struggle, and I know by the 8th, 9th round when I'm looking at these veterans, which is when I start to take veterans, that, hey, there's too many other tanking teams, so I don't want to be fighting for just the scraps. I don't have enough of an advantage over these guys. I'm going to kind of try to build out like a slightly competing team because the thing is, those other teams that are going productive struggle are only drafting rookies usually. So they're not drafting any of the cheap veterans that they can sell to the other teams in season when they're actually worth more points. So I think like unless there's not other teams doing it, I like to build sort of a tweener build, decide how I'm doing. Usually I pick up a 1st or a couple of 1sts or a 1st and a couple of 2nds. So I have the ability to, if my Raheem Mostert, Najee Harris running back room or whatever I end up getting, maybe it's James Conner in double-digit rounds, is actually has me competing with the compilation of young studs and a couple like middling Christian Kirk, like Chris Godwin type of players as well, has me in the realm of competing. I now have the ability to actually push the chips in. And if I'm struggling, I have some assets that either I can hold and just kind of be mid, or I can start selling those. And the other productive struggle teams that are actually there don't have the type of assets that people want to buy. So usually this is the direction I actually lean, especially because I haven't been in a draft in a long time. Actually, I've been in one this offseason where there's not at least 2 or 3 teams productive struggling. I have 6 firsts in that league. I love it. But usually through round 5 or 6, you'll see 3 or 4 teams that have all picked up an extra 25 first. And if that is the case, then I kind of want to differentiate myself because I don't actually think I'm smarter than everybody. And I don't think that I can necessarily do the same strategy better than everybody else. So then I want to try to actually differentiate my strategy a little bit and give myself more flexibility. So I think it's really important to try to really tune into what everyone else is doing and come up with a way to differentiate if four people are trying to do it.
People are always trying to trade after the startup. So you make a good point. Sometimes a guy like, I think it was Deontay Johnson, I feel like I talk about him all the time. If he's falling, a round or two past where you think he should, yeah, pick him up. And then you could trade him in season or before the season when people are trying to fill up their rosters.
Yeah, and I have a couple comments I want to make on what you said there too, Justin. First of all, I think mentioning that you like to try to get a later startup pick when you're selling one of those early mid-round picks, 5th through 7th, 8th, whatever. Awesome process, and I should have mentioned it. But I would take just a first for most of those picks as well. But if you can get like an 11th, 12th, 13th, whatever, not only does it keep your options open if you want to compete and draft a veteran producer at that range, but you might be able to get a second or, add a third in to get a second or something too if you do commit fully to a productive struggle. And the other thing I want to mention is that, to me at least, while this is a startup strategy, you get the whole off season for the strategy. Until games start, you can still adjust to it. You can go into it. You can get out of it. Example I want to use to illustrate that is a startup that we did earlier this year. At the end of it, I was a fairly competitive roster with some flexibility, and Justin was a fairly decent productive struggle with not a lot of competitive pieces this year. Right now, if you look at these teams, I am full-blown productive struggle, and Justin is probably the favorite for the championship. We made a couple big trades with each other, but we also made a couple trades with other teams. I think we both were approached by other managers that tried to entice us to go the opposite direction, and then we talked to each other and we're like, hey, I might be looking to flip from a competitor to a rebuilder. Would you be interested in trading some picks? And so once all that started to snowball, now we're at where we're at now. And even though I was not a productive struggle in that startup draft, I am right now. So I still consider that to be a productive struggle personally.
Yeah, absolutely. It's easiest to go that direction in the draft, but you can also go that direction if you give yourself like the right type of assets that people want to buy. Like you had Tyreek Hill. That's a guy people want to buy, right? That's a guy that I bought from you, right? So you can absolutely, if you're willing to hear out where the market's going, you can transition into the productive struggle after the draft. But you did also make some moves. I know you at least acquired 125 first in the draft. So it's not like you were entirely away from there. Yeah, that's a really good point. I do want to touch on one more thing, which is let's actually kind of define, give or take, what we think, and I can go first here, is the fair market line for a 25 first in a startup. And I'm going to say any pick in the 6th round and later, I would take a 25 first for. If I am in the 5th round and earlier, I personally probably want to wait a little bit and see who's in the clock, especially if it's the earlier part of the 5th round. If it's the later part of the 5th round, I'd say I probably want to hold my 5th round picks personally, unless I'm getting like a 14th or a 15th round pick back where I can just get a flyer, or I can get like a 3rd round pick in the future back.
I think that's a great line. I think it is right around that 5th to 6th round turn in like a super flex, even tight end premium league. I think guys that are kind of on that cusp are guys like T. Higgins, Mark Andrews, JSN, maybe Jonathan Brooks. I think that's kind of in the range where which players? Mark Andrews?
I think Andrews. Oh my God.
I know, right? That's probably for non-tight end premium, but yeah, those are the guys that I'm seeing just like keep trade cut wise that are around, where that end of the 5th round would be. Like Addison, who do you want? Addison, Brian Thomas Jr., Higgins. Do you want all of those over first?
First. Give me the firsts.
What about Pickens, Zay Flowers?
I like both of those guys, but process probably says first.
That's why I want that 14th round pick so I can feel better about it.
Yeah, Zay Flowers, at least on Keep Trade Cut, says he'd be around like the middle of the 5th round. George Pickens right near the end of the 5th round. So I do think that line right near the end of the 5th is where I do start to consider. I tend to agree with you guys there.
Yeah, I think that's probably a fair starting place for the line, but it's very league dependent. And it also depends on how the draft falls. If you feel like you've already committed to being a productive struggler and someone else has come in and hit a couple of big trades and now all of a sudden they're ahead of you on that pace, maybe you're more willing to trade your mid to late 5th round pick than you would be in another, situation. If you've still kept your flexibility, maybe you're, willing to hold a little bit later. So it just depends on a lot of things. Tight end premium is important because that gives tight ends inflated value. There's just a lot of factors to consider, but I do think it typically falls somewhere between the mid 5th and the mid 6th.
And of course, that line is going to change every year. Every league's economy is slightly different, but really good to keep in mind. If you're in our listener league that we're starting in about a week, though, don't pay attention to this episode at all. In fact, go back and forget everything we said and trade us your future firsts. We would love to have those from all of you. So from all of us here at the Down Construction Podcast, we hope you found this as useful and informative for you as it was for us. We definitely had some fun diving into the history behind this strategy and thinking about how we can improve on it over time. Give us a like, subscribe wherever you listen, and from all of us here, until next time.